So welcome to our panel discussion of the book The Legacy of Kluger and the End of the Auschwitz Century. Jonathan Skolnick, please welcome the Institute for Holocaust Genocide and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. We're lucky to be recording this book panel for those who can't be here in person today. It's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists who will present perspectives on the book and then open up the discussion and take our questions. And I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking now. First, in the middle, we have Caroline Machtans, who's Associate Professor and Chair of German Studies at Connecticut College. She's the author of Zwischen Wissenschaft und autobiographischen Projekt, Saul Friedlander und Kluger, from 2009. She's the co-editor of Hitler, Films from Germany, History, Cinema, and Politics since 1945. The co-editor with Helga Druxis and Alexander Mikhailovich of the first volume of criticism in English dedicated to the Iranian German author and scholar of Islam Navid Kermani, that from 2016, and co-editor together with David Khoury of the first volume in English about Iraqi German author Abbas Hidel from 2021. And our second panelist will be Karen Remler, who's Mary Lyons Professor of Humanities at Mount Holyoke College. She focuses in her research and teaching in English and German on politics and cultures of transnational memory and on forensic approaches to the remains of the dead in the aftermath of atrocity, as well as their visual representation and transformations into subjects of culturally specific forms of proper burial. She also writes and teaches on the remembrance of the Holocaust in global perspective, contemporary German, Jewish, Afro-German, and Turkish-German cultures, migration, and global cultural forms of transitional justice. Her recent articles focus on the production of transgenerational memory of the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide through digital technologies, the afterlives of dead refugees in the digital age, and an essay on residual remembrance of family genealogies, which appeared on being adjacent to histories of violence, edited by the Cantus. She's also working on a family memoir that explores the intersections of family trauma with collective national narratives of war, and she's participated in and facilitated seminars for faculty that address intersections of memoir and academic writing. Finally, on my left, Raphaël Sigal is Associate Professor of French at Amherst College. His first book, Artaud, Le Sens de la Lecture, came out in 2018, and his articles about Walter Benjamin, Gerasim Luca, Edmond Jabès, Maurice Blanchot, and others have appeared in the journals Diacritics, Critique, and French Forum, among others. He's currently at work on a book about exile entitled Le Monde dans un livre, le livre dans la poche. They'll speak in order and then discuss and take questions. Please welcome our panelists.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to focus on my teaching experiences at a liberal arts college, and I thought I should speak to students and also family alike. So let me begin my brief remarks with a quote from Irina Heidelberger-Leonard's contribution to the new volume. She asks, as we approach the end of the Auschwitz century with the last survivors disappearing, what will happen to the literature of the Shoah as it passes from memory to history? As she argues, the work of Ruth Kluger, together with that of Jean Améry and Imre Kertész, belongs to a fourth stage of Holocaust studies, a stage that, quote, takes the idea of testimony to a much more complex and self-reflexive level, end of quote. It is this self-reflexivity of Ruth Klüger's work and her invitation to critical dialogue, as I will argue, that makes it a timeless contribution to some of the most pressing issues of our time, especially questions of forced migration. At a time when 89.3 million people worldwide are forcibly displaced, her interventions are more important than ever. Ever since publishing my first book with Niemeyer, Conditio Judaica, in 2009, with a wonderful foreword from Alon, I have to mention that, Ruth Klüger has continued to impact both my scholarship and teaching. Most people will probably immediately think of her autobiographical text, Weiterleben, Still Alive, and indeed, these texts are and will forever be part of my first year seminar representing the Holocaust. Yet Ruth Klüger's legacy for me goes far beyond that. In her 2016 Bundestag talk on forced child labor addressing the German parliament, she ended her speech with the following words, and I quote from the speech: "This land, which was responsible for the worst crimes of the century 80 years ago, has won the world's praise today. Thanks to its open borders and the magnanimity with which you have accepted and continue to do so the number of Syrian and other refugees. I am one of the many people that was moved from surprise to admiration. And this was the main reason why I accepted your invitation with great pleasure, seizing the opportunity in this event in this capital city to be able to speak about former wrongdoings, here in this place in which a rival model has emerged following the seemingly humble and yet heroic motto, we will manage." Wir schaffen das, obviously. End of quote. It is this connection between her Holocaust experience and the experiences of refugees today that makes her work extremely relevant for my other courses as well, including but not limited to my first year seminar on international refugee law, politics, and representations. As Vera Schwartz reminds us in her poetic contribution on ghosts and mourning in Chinese literature in this volume, Klüger's critical reflections on persecution, statelessness, trauma, language, survival, witnessing, remembrance, and representation are timeless and relatable. Approaching traumatic experiences through literature, especially poetry, are as relevant today. This holds especially true for child refugees and survivors of trauma, as Monica Tempian argues in her moving contribution about multilingual poetry and diary entries written by children during the Holocaust. Texts, as she argues with reference to James Edward Young, that provide us with an understanding of children's narrative grasp of the events and thus historical reality itself. As Tempian argues in our volume, quote, "Poetic forms, as Klüger points out, also function as a means to oppose and contain chaos through clarity of thought set into formally fixed language." End of quote. It is the poetic representation of violence, disorientation, confusion, isolation, and uncertainty about their identity that has the potential to initiate a dialogue with survivors of trauma today. Not as equations, as Klüger would remind us, but as a means of approaching their own timescapes. Ruth Klüger's work is also present in more theoretical seminars, with her emphasis on the impact of scholars' own personal backgrounds on their scholarly work, her critical engagement with the relationship between facts and fiction, and her insistence that autobiography is, quote, "the most subjective form of historiography," which comes up in the volume several times. She's also present when I encourage my first year students, especially female students, or anyone really, that they do have something to say about literature, and that literature always has been and always will be speaking to us across the centuries. It is her understanding of literature as a dialogue between the author and the reader that students are drawn to. And I often share with them what is probably my favorite Ruth Klüger quote from her acceptance speech of the Grimmelshausen Prize in 1995, in which she asked herself what he, 17th century German author Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelshausen himself, best known for his picaresque novel Der Abenteuer hier Simplicissimus about the 30 Years' War, what this author of the most famous German novel of the 17th century would have to say about her getting an award carrying his name. And I'm going to read it in German and then summarize part of it in English, because her language is just so much like her. So grüble ich vor mich hin, was denn zu diesem Preis sagen würde, während ich meinen erkalteten Kaffee zum Aufwärmen in den Mikrowellenherd stelle. Und wie ich mich umdrehe, siehe, da sitzt er. Ein wenig im Schatten, denn sein Gesicht kann ich mir nicht recht vorstellen. Seine Stimme viel eher. Ich bin nicht erstaunt. Wenn ich Probleme mit Autoren habe, fange ich an, mit ihnen zu diskutieren. Und bevor man sich's versieht, ist aus der einseitigen Auseinandersetzung eine Beschwörung geworden. Und die Dichter sitzen bei dir am Küchentisch und lassen sich auf deine Reden ein. And I'm just translating part of it. And as I turn around, look, there he is. I'm not surprised. Whenever I have issues with authors, I start a conversation with them. And before you know it, the one-sided discussion has turned into an incantation. And the writers sit at your kitchen table and get involved in your conversations. In other words, literature for Ruth Klüger is accessible. She enthusiastically invites us to read, an enthusiasm that only Marcel Reich-Ranitzky could match, and to enter into a dialogue with literature across the centuries. The direct, deliberately naive tone is obviously a deliberate trademark of her authorial style, as Heinrich Detering points out in his contribution, allowing Ruth Klüger to challenge both the hermetically sealed literature that Sander Gilman mentioned earlier and a supposedly objective scholarly detachment. Rather, it is her personal experience that validates what she writes about, or to use her own words, and we've heard them before, but it existed. I am a witness. Just last week, we analyzed Irani-German author and scholar of Islam Navid Kermani's essay Einbruch der Wirklichkeit, documenting the route of refugees in Europe in 2015 and 16. Asking my students what kind of text we have in front of us, one of them pointed out that even though it's very well researched, there are no footnotes. Rather, the text seems to gain its authority from the personal experiences it is based upon. We then talked about Adorno's The Essay of Form, and of course, the genre of Ruth Klüger's scholarly essays. So I bring it up all the time. A number of the contributions in this volume engage with Klüger's relationship to Judaism and Zionism and the Jewishness of her voice. Of special interest to me are Mark Gelber's contribution, which ends, as we have seen, with a draft of Ruth Klüger's tombstone that highlights her multiple linguistic and cultural attachments and her transnational life, and Ulrike Offenberg's contribution, in which she outlines the history of the Kaddish and argues that the poems Ruth Klüger composed became her own form of Kaddish. Taking Offenberg's essay as a point of departure, I would argue that Klüger's habit of reciting poems should be read not only as a specifically Jewish, but rather as a human coping strategy. A coping strategy for anyone who experiences historical trauma, including today's forcibly displaced persons, among them a great number of children. Based on Klüger's invitation to critical dialogue, I have a strong feeling that she would appreciate this. Reaching out to each other by way of comparison, without equating, without glossing over the differences, and without appropriating other people's stories. Thank you.
So first of all, I just wanted to thank Jonathan and Mark for the invitation, and it's lovely to be here with so many friends and people that I'm glad that I've met at this point. So I decided today for my comments on the volume to talk a little bit about not just the Jewish context in which Klüger writes, but also other spheres of thought and modes of being that are interrelated in precise insight and I would say fierce feminist insistence on agency and a voice for those brutally deprived of both. And at the same time, I'd like to emphasize that Ruth does not speak for other victims, and that's something that I want to accentuate in my comments today. Given my own work on the afterlives of the dead in the wake of extreme violence, I wanted to focus on the ways in which the essays in this volume conjure Ruth's presence. And I would say her ghost is surely with us here, or should I say spirit. I also want to state from the onset that I won't be able to comment on all the essays, so I hope those of the essay contributors are patient. I also want to end by placing Ruth in adjacency with another Austrian, albeit non-Jewish, poet, Ingeborg Bachmann, who I think is incredibly important for our discussion on Ruth Kluge. Let me start with an anecdote. We've heard a lot of anecdotes. I did not know Ruth very well. I was sort of in awe of her when I first met her at a Women in German conference when I was a Mayer graduate student. But I did have the opportunity to attend an event in Berlin shortly after Weiterleben came out. And this was a conversation with Sigrid Weigel, some of you may know as a renowned feminist scholar, who was the director and founder of the Center for Literature and Cultural Research in Berlin. And this was at the Literaturhaus in Wannsee, so already an implicated space. And Sigrid Weigel began the evening by addressing Weiterleben as a text to be interpreted, not as an untouchable script. And in the moment that Sigrid Weigel expressed her thoughts on the memoir as a text, not unflawed, the audience began to boo. Weigel had committed the unconscionable sin of criticizing a Holocaust survivor. The audience had amalgamated the person, Ruth Kluge, with her work. Ruth looked out at the audience with clear annoyance, waved her hand, and said sharply, and you'll have to imagine, Viennese here, "Bitte, seien Sie ruhig. Ich möchte hören, was meine Kollegin zu sagen hat. Das interessiert mich." In other words, she basically told the audience to shut up. To see her not as a survivor on a pedestal, a fragile victim, or conversely as a noble and heroic person, but rather as a scholar in conversation with another scholar. That is, she implied with her response that any reverence for her work as a writer deserved to be taken seriously, not because of some rote piety, but because her work also reflects a complicated, multi-layered, and multifaceted subject deserving of critical discernment in conversation with other scholars. So this leads me to the three themes I want to evoke in my remarks, and that I see that course through this collection of essays. Number one, Ruth's insistence that we avoid concept kitsch and a monolithic honoring of Holocaust survivors. And of course, many of these things have come up repeatedly, so this is sort of a variation on a theme. Number two, the form of critical engagement with her work evoked by sitting with the discomfort of face-to-face encounters. And three, Ruth's engagement with the impossible term Heimat. I would close by suggesting we recall the afterlife of Ingeborg Bachmann in relation to Ruth's work. So this volume reiterates Ruth's insistence on the multifaceted legacies and existences of Holocaust survivors and indeed other survivors of mass violence perpetrated by humans against humans. She often insisted that even as a survivor, she could not or would not speak for the dead nor engage in rituals of forgiveness. And we see this in The Landscapes of Memory, the film, when she visits Bergen-Belsen, reads the memorial inscription, paraphrased, "Through their violent death, the living are reminded to resist injustice." She expresses her impatience for what she calls this nonsensical attempt to make sense out of suffering. This is a theme conjured again and again in the essays, especially in Daniel Reynolds' piece, whose critical engagement and disagreement about how one assesses so-called Holocaust tourism speaks to the evocative register of Ruth's work to open up spaces for debate, to a point. Many of the essays emphasize Kluger's distaste, even disgust, for what we see in the film, or see in the film, as a mistaken assumption that one can make sense out of an event like the Holocaust. And yet her analyses of Holocaust remembrance demonstrate again and again a mandate to remember, not in isolation, not through rote ritual, but through acute listening and equally acute honesty. She enacts such keen observance of observation in her poetry by acting out, as Sandra Gilman relates in his essay, or in Weiterleben through implicit conversations with other Holocaust survivors, such as Jean Amery or Imre Kertész, so wonderfully articulated by Ingeborg Heidelberger-Lennart. Ruth claims resentment as a legitimate feeling for survivors. In her own words, resentment is an appropriate feeling for an injustice that can never be atoned for. Even so, a common thread in the essays and in her work is her insistence on dialogue, not as reconciliation, but as a form of accountability for any of us who engage with histories of violence, to quote Irene. I refer you to Stephen Braze's text on Speaking with Germans as an excellent overview of the changing landscape in Germany, as exemplified in Weiterleben by the Christoph figure, Martin Walzer, and the tendency of many German readers to enact exactly the phenomena that Ruth writes against. However, the encounter with the living is not the only difficult encounter. Ulrike Offenberg considers Ruth's relationship to the dead through a discussion of the precarious role of women in saying Kaddish. As Offenberg so elegantly relates in her reading of Ruth's poem Yom Kippur, the dead are ever present and, quote, refuse to grant the living, this is a quote of Offenberg's, refuse to grant the living alleviation, closure, and peace. Offenberg refers us to a passage in Still Alive, quote, remembering is a branch of witchcraft, its tool is incantation. Instead of God, I believe in ghosts. To conjure up the dead, you have to dangle the bait of the present before them, the flesh of the living, to coax them out of their inertia. Indeed, Ruth's writing not only coaxes the dead out of their inertia, she insists that they have a place at the table. 2. The contributors to this volume also honor Ruth by critically engaging with her writing and public statements. They mirror her unyielding ability to face others as an exchange deserving of mutual respect, to a point. This also includes the right to do an about-face, as it were, when encounters with some Germans yield no willingness to engage self-critically. Again, Ruth engages with others, to a point. In other words, through her feminist gaze, she enacts what the Jewish French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas calls facing the other, to hold the gaze of the other, not through identification or a useless empathy, but through a yielding of one's own ground in order to make space for the ground of others. Again, to a point. Ceding to those less fortunate a space of their own, so to speak, Ruth's work creates space for forgotten writers, particularly women and Jews, to be seen and to be heard. And I would say that the film, Landscapes of Memory, also focuses on this theme through its unrelenting yet compassionate close-ups of Ruth's face vis-a-vis the faces of younger generations. At Bergen-Belsen, there's a scene in the film that takes place at Bergen-Belsen. These faces are placed in contrast to the symbolic grave of Anne Frank. As Ruth puts it, a single face stands out and you remember again. And this engagement extends beyond Europe or the United States. Vera Schwartz in the volume places Kluger's work in conversation with Chinese writers and survivors of the Cultural Revolution. And I can attest to the evocative discussion with international students, not just from China, but also from South Asia, Southeast Asia, other parts of the globe where genocide continues, sadly, to be a part of national fabrics and narratives. In order to do this work, Schwartz beautifully reminds us that Ruth wants us to be Geisterseher, ghost seers. Not seers, seer, S-E-E-R. Readers more open to untold, storied, and unseen presences. 3. Finally, a number of essays evoke Ruth's restlessness and engagement with spaces that she has traversed in her remembrance of her childhood, as a child, then as a forced pariah, a prisoner, self-liberator, immigrant, teacher, scholar, traveler, and mother. How do these essays in the volume conjure the impossibility of Heimat for those brutally ripped from their places of origin, such as Ruth, and yet create spaces that evoke a citizenship that is not tainted by nationalisms or exclusions. Again, a number of contributors, including Mark and Sander, also some of the folks that I've mentioned, Ulrike, and others, point out the significance of place, both real and imaginary, for conjuring not just memory, but also an insistence on unmasking the ongoing after effect of the ideologies and actions that constituted the Holocaust within a larger framework of oppression, not bound by episodes or borders. Other contributors, such as Monica Templin, also write eloquently about the particular conjuring of the past that refuses to be past, particularly through the lens of Kluger's lamentation of the loss of home, and along with it, a future that would never be. The loss of childhood, and with it, an attachment to place that would have served as Heimat, an anchor in storms, appears as a deeply painful trope in the writing and memories of other Jewish children, subject to, quote, a violently disrupted life course, disorientation, confusion, and the uncertainty about their identity. Templin places children's voices among other voices, thus reminding us of Ruth's insistence that the time of destroyed childhood become a part of, quote, inhabited memory by evoking the name of places in order to retroactively at least attempt to rebuild bridges between past and present when all that is left are mere remnants like the floating piers of blown up bridges. I want to end by placing the essays in this volume in conversation with Kluger and Bachmann. For those of you who don't know, Ingeborg Bachmann was probably the best-known Austrian post-war writer, poet, novelist, essayist, radio playwright in the German-speaking realm. At the risk of reducing Bachmann's complex and much-interpreted poem, Böhmen liegt am Meer, Bohemia is on the sea, to a few lines, I believe that these lines express exactly the steep ambivalence and yet equivocal staunchness that constitutes Ruth's stance on the subjects that the volume has so clearly clarified and accentuated. Ich grenz noch an ein Wort und an ein anderes Land, ich grenz wie wenig auch an alles immer mehr, ein Böhme, ein Vagant, der nichts hat, den nichts hält, begabt nur noch vom Meer, das strittig ist, Land meine Wahl zu sehen. I still border on a word and on another land. I border, like little else, on everything, more and more. A bohemian, a wandering minstrel who has nothing, who is held by nothing, gifted only at seeing by a doubtful sea the land of my choice. Thank you.
I'll start by saying that I'm pretty intimidated right now because I did not know Ruth Kluger last April when I received an email to participate in this event. And as I think it happened, it's a chain of friendship that got me here today. So it's the first time I'm speaking to an audience that you all know more about Ruth Kluger than I do. That said, reading this book over the summer produced a small shock, and I will talk about that right now. I have thought about different titles for the remarks I was invited to make today to celebrate Ruth Kluger's legacy. I will just share two of these titles. The first one that came to my mind was more scholarly. It was found by the professor in me. It was Weiterleben against Überleben. The German title of her book produced very profound echoes in me. Weiterleben, not Überleben, to go on living, not to survive. In French, survivre, the verb, and survie, the noun, have the same connotation as Überleben. They point to the fact that the survivors, les survivants, are sur la vie, on the surface of life, incapable of going back into life, dans la vie. Going through death excludes them from life. And it is very much how I experienced Shoah in my own family as I grew up in Paris. This leads me to my second title, which is grounded in my autobiography, in my relationship with my own family and my own ghosts. It is Ruth Kluger as grandmother. And I cannot resist saying that after watching yesterday's documentary, I want to amend the title to Ruth Kluger as badass grandmother, which, according to the Merriam-Webster, means both ready to cause trouble, and of formidable strength or skill. And I think it describes her pretty well. When I discovered Still Alive over the summer, I was immediately taken by it. The content of the story felt familiar. Her art of the address to the reader, though, was completely new to me. Dear reader, don't wax sentimental, she writes on page 123, as she delves in the complicated relationship she had with her own mother. On page 93, she recalls going to the conference about the Shoah in Germany, she writes, so I listen in bored silences to speeches about the Holocaust, with the usual self-enclosed phrases that don't engage anyone's attention, let alone imagination. And when I am with company, I let others talk. And she adds in parentheses, you might not invite me back if I didn't. Her outspoken inability to forgive also provided me with great comfort. I can't forget, she writes. Forgiving makes me sick. Yes, 2 generations later, I can't forget either. And forgiving also makes me sick. And I must confess that also seeing Ruth rebuking her German colleague from UCI yesterday in the documentary felt really good. Ruth Kluger is a badass, iconoclast, unapologetic, outspoken grandmother. She is a grandmother from California who tells her story, who speaks German, who doesn't believe in the unspeakable, a grandmother who is a literature professor and who writes books. My grandmothers were born in Germany in 1927 and 1932. They immigrated to France and they remained silent. I inherited silence from them, not words, a feminine silence, because in my family women did not speak. After spending a few days with Still Alive, I knew more about Ruth than I would ever be able to know about my grandmothers. For people of my generation, the 3rd generation, Ruth's book constitutes what the French writer Georges Perec, calls a potential autobiography. An autobiography written in the condition, this could have been my grandmother. As I read the essays reunited in The Legacy of Ruth Kluger and the End of the Auschwitz Century, I went through a number of feelings. I was frustrated to realize how bad my German is, despite spending 7 years learning it in middle and high school. I was angry to learn that Ruth wrote a parody of Celan's later poems, which she found abstruse, not Tolosfuge, thank God, and I was reassured that she thought that Austerlitz by Sebald was a good novel. I marveled at the quantity of poems contained in this collection of essays in Czech and German and Yiddish and English, of course. And I smiled learning that she fit neatly into the category of American Jew, because this fitting, so probably not belonging, but maybe she also had a feeling of belonging here, is not obvious, and it seems to be a great victory and a great deal for a refugee with her kind of trajectory. These feelings of sadness and happiness and frustration and anger are precisely the ones that I didn't have with my own grandmothers. And so these are ones that I can graft on my grandmother's ghosts, feelings that will make them more talkative. Well, thank you very much.
Do you all want to respond to each other first? Or just add to the comments you've made?
Well, we can open it up, I think. Do you want to, I mean, I'm happy to open it up to the audience. I don't know what about you two.
Well, the one thing that came into my mind is how personal everything was, like the enthusiasm and personal connection. I think that came across in all 3 contributions.
I thought all 3 of you were great.